Every morning, the girl walked into the classroom carrying the same metal lunchbox. It wasn't colorful. It didn't have cartoons or stickers or a name written in marker on the side. Just dull silver, slightly dented at the corners, with a latch that clicked softly when she set it down. She always placed it under her desk, carefully, as if it mattered where it landed. At first, no one noticed. Children are good at blending into routines. When something repeats often enough, it stops standing out. The bell rang. Backpacks were dropped. Chairs scraped against the floor. The class settled into the familiar rhythm of another ordinary day. And the lunchbox stayed closed. When snack time came, the other kids opened paper bags and plastic containers. Apples rolled, juice boxes crinkled. Someone always traded something. Someone always complained. The girl didn't. She sat with her hands folded on the desk and watched the clock. On the first day, the teacher smiled and asked gently, "Not hungry?" The girl shook her head. "I ate at home." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Like it had been practiced. The teacher nodded and moved on. The second day, it happened again. The third day, too. By the end of the week, the teacher noticed something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just that the lunchbox stayed closed. It was the way the girl never touched it, never fidgeted with the latch, never peeked inside. It was as if the object didn't exist at all, except that it did. It was always there. The teacher had been in classrooms long enough to know that children rarely hide things without a reason. But she also knew something else. Jumping to conclusions could do more harm than good. She had seen misunderstandings turn into problems. She had learned to be careful. So she waited. Weeks passed. The girl remained polite, quiet. She did her work. She raised her hand only when she was absolutely sure of the answer. She never caused trouble, never cried, never complained, and the lunchbox never opened. Sometimes during recess, the teacher noticed the girl sitting on the steps instead of running with the others. Sometimes she saw her fingers curl protectively around the metal handle when someone walked too close. Sometimes she caught a look on the girl's face, something like relief when lunchtime ended. Still, nothing felt obvious enough to act on, until one morning felt different. It started like any other. Same desks, same sunlight through the windows, same lunchbox placed under the desk with care. But halfway through the lesson, something shifted. It wasn't strong, it wasn't clear. It was just wrong. A faint smell drifted through the room, so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it at all. The teacher paused mid-sentence, unsure whether she was imagining it. She glanced around. The children kept writing, no one reacted. She told herself it was nothing, but her eyes returned without thinking to the metal lunchbox beneath the girl's desk. For the first time, the teacher didn't look away, because in that quiet moment she understood something that made her chest tighten. Not with fear, but with recognition. Whatever was going on hadn't started today. And it wouldn't fix itself by waiting. The lunchbox sat there, closed and silent. And for the first time, the teacher wondered how many days it had been asking for help, without ever making a sound. The next day, the teacher watched the girl more closely. Not in a way that would make her uncomfortable. Not openly. Just small glances. Moments stolen between instructions and chalk dust, between questions and answers. Years in the classroom had taught her how to observe without staring. Snack time arrived the same way it always did. The room filled with familiar sounds. Wrappers opened, lids popped, lids. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone asked for a napkin. The ordinary noise of children being children. The girl reached under her desk and lifted the metal lunchbox onto her lap. The latch stayed closed. She didn't even look at it. The teacher walked past her desk and stopped. She kept her voice light, almost casual. "Do you want to eat something today?" The girl looked up right away. Her expression didn't change, but her answer came fast. "I'm not hungry." The teacher smiled. "You say that every day." For just a moment, so brief it could have been missed, the girl hesitated, then she nodded. "I ate at home." The words were the same as before. Perfect, polite, finished. The teacher thanked her and moved on, but something about the exchange stayed with her. Not what was said, but how it was said. The girl hadn't sounded unsure. She hadn't sounded afraid. She sounded responsible. Later that morning, the class worked quietly on their assignments. The teacher walked between the rows, checking progress. When she reached the girl's desk, she noticed something new. The lunchbox had shifted. It was no longer tucked neatly under the desk. It sat between the girl's feet, angled slightly away from the aisle, as if being hidden, though nothing about the girl's posture suggested secrecy. Her shoes rested close to it, protectively. The teacher didn't comment. She didn't bend down. She didn't ask to see inside. Experience had taught her that pressing too hard could close doors instead of opening them. Still, the thought followed her for the rest of the day. At dismissal, as children lined up to leave, the teacher noticed the girl waiting longer than the others. She adjusted her backpack straps twice, checked the floor, looked at the clock. Finally, she lifted the lunchbox and held it against her side as she walked out. Not swinging it, not dragging it, holding it carefully like something fragile. That night, the teacher thought about her own rules, the ones she had built over decades of teaching. Don't assume, don't overreact, don't see danger where there is none. But there was another rule she had learned too. Children don't carry unnecessary weight unless they believe they have to. The following morning, the teacher arrived early. She straightened desks, wrote the date on the board, and set out materials. When the girl entered, she smiled and said hello as usual. The lunchbox appeared under the desk again, closed. When snack time came, the teacher made a decision. She knelt beside the girl's desk so they were at eye level. Her voice was warm, steady. "If you ever feel hungry here," she said, "you can tell me, that's okay." The girl looked at her hands. Then she shook her head gently. "I'm okay," she said. "I can wait." Wait for what? The teacher wondered. The girl picked up her pencil and returned to her work, the conversation clearly finished in her mind. The teacher stood and walked back to the front of the room. She realized something then, something that made her pause before speaking to the class. The girl wasn't refusing food, she was refusing to need it, and whatever had taught her to do that hadn't happened at school. The teacher told herself to slow down. She had learned over many years that not every strange detail meant danger. Classrooms were full of quiet habits and small oddities. Some children hated loud noises. Some never liked to eat in front of others. Some carried worries that had nothing to do with what they held in their hands. And experience had taught her another lesson too. Acting too quickly could leave marks that never faded. She had seen it before, a well-meant question that turned into embarrassment. A careful call that became a misunderstanding. Families hurt by assumptions that could never quite be taken back. So she waited. Days continued to line up neatly, one after another. Lessons were taught, papers were graded. The seasons outside the windows began to shift, almost unnoticed. And every day the girl arrived with the same metal lunchbox. The teacher tried to focus on what she could measure. The girl completed her assignments on time. Her handwriting was neat. Her answers were thoughtful. When called on, she spoke clearly. She wasn't falling behind. She wasn't acting out. On paper, everything looked fine, but classrooms weren't built of paper alone. There were moments the teacher couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. The way the girl's shoulders tightened when lunchtime approached. The way she checked the clock, not with impatience, but with calculation. The way she seemed relieved when the bell rang, as if she had passed a test no one else knew about. The teacher noticed, too, how the lunchbox never joined the others. It stayed separate, always within reach, always closed. Once, another child asked, "What do you have in there?" The girl smiled politely. "Just lunch. Nothing more, nothing less." The teacher watched that exchange carefully. There was no fear in the girl's voice, no hesitation. Just a smooth answer that ended the conversation completely. That smoothness worried her more than silence would have. Still, the teacher reminded herself of the line she had learned not to cross too soon. Children deserved privacy, families deserved trust, and certainty mattered. Then came the memory she wished she could forget. Years ago, there had been another student. Another concern that had seemed obvious in hindsight but unclear at the time. The teacher had waited then too, not because she didn't care, but because she was afraid of being wrong. By the time she acted, the moment had passed. The help that might have come sooner arrived late. The teacher had carried that weight quietly ever since. Now, standing at the front of the room, she felt something familiar pressing at the edges of her thoughts. A warning, gentle but persistent. She began to ask herself different questions. Not, is this serious enough? But, how long has this been happening? Not, am I overreacting? But, what if waiting is the mistake? The girl bent over her notebook, pencil moving steadily. From the outside, she looked calm, capable, in control. But children weren't meant to manage everything alone. That afternoon, as the students packed their bags, the teacher watched the girl slide the lunchbox into her backpack. Not on top, not easily reachable, hidden beneath books. The teacher opened her mouth to say something, anything. Then she closed it again. Experience whispered caution. Instinct whispered urgency. She chose caution. As the classroom emptied, the teacher sat alone at her desk, staring at the faint outline of where the lunchbox had rested all day. She told herself she was being patient, responsible, careful. But patience, she knew, could be hard to tell apart from delay. And somewhere between those two, something important was being carried home, unseen, unopened, and waiting. If anyone had asked the teacher what worried her, she wouldn't have known how to answer. There was no single moment she could point to. No clear sign that demanded action. Only small things, so small they almost disappeared when looked at directly. The girl still arrived on time every morning. She still smiled when greeted. She still carried the metal lunchbox and slid it under her desk with the same careful motion. But the teacher began to notice patterns where she had once seen coincidences. At recess, the girl didn't run anymore. She walked to the edge of the playground and sat on the low steps near the building. From there, she could see everything. The swings, the ball games, the groups forming and breaking apart. She watched instead of joining. When another child invited her to play, she often shook her head politely. Maybe tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow never came. Inside the classroom, the girl chose her seat carefully. Not too close to others, not too far away. Always where she could keep the lunchbox within sight. Once, during a group activity, the teacher asked the children to move their desks together. As the desks shifted, the lunchbox was nudged accidentally by a passing foot. The girl froze. It was just for a second, a quick intake of breath. Her hands moved instantly, pulling the lunchbox closer, setting it upright again. "I'm sorry," the other child said. "It's okay," the girl replied at once. Her voice was calm again, too calm. The teacher pretended not to notice, but her attention stayed fixed on the girl for the rest of the lesson. During art time, paint jars were passed around. The teacher noticed the girl rinsing her hands longer than necessary. During cleanup, she checked her backpack twice before zipping it closed. Little habits, easy to explain away, but together they began to form a picture that wouldn't quite settle. The teacher started keeping track without meaning to, not writing things down, just remembering. The girl never asked for seconds when snacks were shared. She never forgot her lunchbox. She never opened it. Even when alone, one afternoon as the class lined up for dismissal, the fire alarm was tested unexpectedly. The sudden noise startled everyone. Children covered their ears. Someone laughed nervously. The girl flinched harder than the others. Her hand went straight to the lunchbox, not her ears, not her backpack. The lunchbox. The teacher felt a quiet chill. Later, when the room was empty, she stood by the window and replayed the day in her mind. None of the moments were alarming by themselves. Each one had an explanation. Each one could be brushed aside. But the explanations were starting to feel thinner. She thought of how adults often missed things. Not because they didn't care, but because life demanded attention everywhere at once. Papers to grade, meetings to attend, rules to follow. It was easier to notice big problems. Small ones slipped through. The next morning, the girl arrived earlier than usual. She took her seat and placed the lunchbox under the desk. The teacher greeted her and began preparing the lesson. When she looked up again, she saw the girl gently nudging the lunchbox farther back with her shoe, just out of sight. The teacher paused. She realized then that she had been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't what was inside the lunchbox. It was why. The girl worked so hard to make sure no one ever saw it. The bell rang, sharp and sudden, pulling the teacher back into motion. The class began its day as always, but the teacher no longer saw small things. She saw signals, and she had the uneasy feeling that they were adding up faster than she was ready for. That morning began like all the others. The hallway buzzed with the low hum of voices. Shoes squeaked against the floor. Lockers opened and closed. The teacher stood by her door, greeting students as they passed, smiling, asking small questions that barely waited for answers. The girl arrived on time, as always. She nodded politely, stepped into the room and placed the metal lunchbox under her desk. The familiar click of the latch echoed softly, barely noticeable. The teacher told herself to breathe, to teach, to let the day unfold. Lessons moved forward. Words filled the board, pencils scratched paper. Everything followed its usual order, until it didn't. Halfway through the morning, the teacher paused mid-sentence. At first she thought it was nothing, a trick of the air, the heating system turning on, someone's shoes still damp from outside. But the feeling returned, not strong, not sharp, just wrong. She glanced around the room. The children kept working, heads down, unaware. No one complained. No one reacted. The teacher took a step toward the window and opened it slightly. Cool air drifted in, but the sensation lingered. Her eyes moved on their own. They stopped at the girl's desk. The lunchbox sat exactly where it always did. Closed. Silent. Untouched. The girl's feet were tucked neatly beside it as if guarding it without realizing. The teacher swallowed. She reminded herself again of everything she had learned over the years. That classrooms held many smells. That imagination could fill in gaps where facts were missing. That one moment didn't mean a pattern. But this wasn't one moment. It was the final note in a long, quiet sequence. The teacher continued the lesson, though the words came more slowly now. Every few seconds, her attention drifted back to the lunchbox, to the girl's stillness, to the way her hands rested flat on the desk, perfectly calm. When snack time arrived, the teacher hesitated. Normally, she would move around the room, helping here, answering there. Today, she stayed near her desk, watching. The children opened their food. The room filled with familiar sounds and scents. The girl did nothing. She didn't reach for the lunchbox. She didn't glance at it. She simply sat and waited, eyes on the clock. The teacher stood. She walked slowly toward the girl's desk and stopped beside it. The girl looked up, polite as ever. "Are you sure you don't want anything?" the teacher asked. The girl shook her head. "I can wait." The words landed heavier than before. "Wait for what?" The teacher smiled and nodded, but inside something shifted. Waiting suddenly felt like the wrong choice. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The smell faded, or perhaps the teacher simply stopped noticing it. But the feeling did not leave. At dismissal, as the children packed their bags, the teacher watched the girl lift the lunchbox and hold it close to her chest. She didn't swing it by the handle. She didn't toss it into her backpack. She carried it carefully, step by step. As the room emptied, the teacher remained standing by her desk. The sunlight slanted across the floor, highlighting the spot where the lunchbox had rested. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit the truth she had been avoiding. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about time. Whatever was happening had been happening for longer than she wanted to imagine. And if she didn't act soon, the quiet signals she had ignored would become something she could never unsee. The teacher reached for the phone on her desk. She didn't dial yet, but she knew she would. The teacher did not make the call right away. She sat at her desk long after the room had emptied, listening to the faint sounds of the building settling around her. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. A cart rolled past. Ordinary noises, doing their best to make everything feel normal again. She looked at the phone. For years she had taught herself to pause before acting, to gather facts, to be sure. That habit had protected her more than once. It had also, she knew, cost time she could never get back. This time felt different. She stood and walked slowly around the classroom, as if seeing it for the first time. The rows of desks, the reading corner, the spot under one desk where the lunchbox usually rested. Empty now. The teacher knelt and touched the floor lightly, then stood again, unsettled by her own gesture. She wasn't looking for answers there. She was reminding herself that this wasn't just a thought in her head. It had a shape, a place, a pattern. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. She told herself she just wanted to be prepared. In truth, she wanted to see what would happen when the girl came in, before the noise, before the rush, before the room filled with distractions. The door opened. The girl stepped inside, holding the metal lunchbox in both hands. She paused when she saw the teacher already there. "Good morning," the teacher said gently. "Good morning," the girl replied. She moved to her desk and placed the lunchbox underneath, exactly as always. Same careful motion, same soft click. Nothing had changed. The teacher watched from across the room, her mind moving through possibilities. Maybe there was an explanation she hadn't considered. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe today would be different. It wasn't. As the class began, the teacher noticed how often her eyes drifted back to that one desk, how every small movement felt louder now, how the quiet no longer felt peaceful. When snack time approached, the teacher made a choice. She didn't announce it. She didn't plan a speech. She simply adjusted the day. Instead of circulating around the room, she stayed near the girl's desk, not hovering, just close enough. The other children opened their food. Laughter bubbled up. A familiar routine unfolded. The girl sat still. The teacher leaned down slightly. "Would you like to sit with me for a moment?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. The girl blinked, surprised, but nodded. She picked up her lunchbox and followed the teacher to a small table near the window. Sunlight fell across the surface of the table. Dust floated lazily in the air. The room hummed behind them. "You can put it here," the teacher said, gesturing to the table. The girl placed the lunchbox down, but she did not move her hands away from it. They sat together for a few seconds in silence. The teacher did not rush. She did not reach for the latch. She did not ask what was inside. Instead, she said, "You've been very patient." The girl looked up, confused. "I'm okay," she said quickly. "I know," the teacher replied. "But sometimes being okay means letting someone help." The girl's fingers tightened around the edges of the lunchbox. "I don't want to be a problem," she whispered. The words were quiet, almost lost. Something inside the teacher settled into place. This wasn't about rules anymore, or hesitation, or being careful. It was about responsibility. The teacher placed her hand on the table, not on the lunchbox, but close enough for the girl to see. "You're not a problem," she said, "and you don't have to carry everything by yourself." The girl didn't answer. But she didn't pull the lunchbox away either. That was enough. The teacher straightened slowly, her heart beating faster than she expected. She looked at the classroom, at the children who trusted her to notice when something wasn't right. Then she looked back at the girl. "I need to make a call," she said softly. "Just to make sure everything is okay." The girl nodded once. The teacher walked to her desk and picked up the phone. This time she didn't hesitate. She dialed, not in panic, not in fear, but because she finally understood that waiting longer was no longer the safest choice. The classroom felt different after the call. Nothing had changed on the surface. The children still worked quietly. The clock still ticked. The sunlight still rested on the floor in warm squares. But the teacher felt as if time itself had slowed. She returned to the small table by the window where the girl sat, both hands resting on the metal lunchbox. The girl's shoulders were straight. Her face was calm, too calm for someone waiting. "It's all right," the teacher said gently. "We can take this slowly." The girl nodded. The lunchbox sat between them, ordinary and unremarkable. Scratched metal, a dent near the corner, the latch dull from use. The teacher noticed how worn it looked now that she was really seeing it. Not old in a careless way, but used, carried, protected. She did not reach for it. Instead, she waited. The girl stared at the latch for a long moment. Then, carefully, she lifted her fingers and touched it. Her movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as if she were following rules only she knew. There was a soft click. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. The lid opened just enough to break the seal. The girl paused again, eyes fixed on the small gap. The teacher held her breath without realizing it. Finally, the girl opened the lunchbox all the way. The teacher did not react right away. There was no sudden gasp, no sharp movement, no dramatic moment. What she saw didn't shout, it whispered. The teacher understood immediately, not because of one specific thing, but because of what it suggested. Time, repetition, days added quietly together, something that had been handled with care but left unchanged for far too long. She closed the lunchbox gently. The girl watched her face, searching for something. Anger, shock, disappointment. She found none of it. The teacher met her eyes and smiled softly. Not a bright smile, a steady one. "Thank you for showing me," she said. The girl's shoulders lowered just a little, as if she had been holding them up for weeks without noticing. "I didn't know what else to do," the girl murmured. The teacher nodded. "I know." They sat in silence for a few seconds. Outside, a bird landed on the window ledge, then flew away. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. The world continued. The teacher picked up the lunchbox and held it carefully, the way the girl always had. "This tells me something important," she said, "but it doesn't tell me everything." The girl frowned. "It doesn't?" "No," the teacher replied. "It tells me this has been going on for a while. It tells me you've been trying to handle it on your own." She set the lunchbox back on the table. "But it doesn't tell me how you got here," she continued, "or how long you've been carrying it." The girl looked down at her hands. "I thought if I waited it would get better." The words landed quietly, but they stayed. The teacher felt a tightness in her chest. Not panic, not fear, but something heavier. But recognition. Waiting. She thought of all the days she had done the same. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Voices approached. The help she had called for was close now. The girl glanced toward the door, then back at the lunchbox. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. The teacher shook her head at once. "No. You did exactly the right thing." The girl studied her face as if testing whether the words were real. The teacher placed her hand on the table again, close but not touching. "This isn't the end of the story," she said quietly. "It's just the first time someone stopped pretending everything was fine." The girl nodded slowly. The lunchbox sat between them, open now, no longer hiding its secret. But the teacher knew with absolute certainty that what she had seen was only the beginning. Whatever this was, it went far beyond a single object. And the hardest part of the story was still waiting to be told. The visitors arrived quietly. There were no flashing lights, no raised voices, no rush that turned heads in the hallway. The school moved on as it always did. Bells rang, doors opened and closed, lessons continued behind other classroom walls. Only this room had changed. The teacher walked the girl to the small office near the front of the building. She stayed close but not tight, close enough to be there, far enough to let the girl breathe. The lunchbox was carried between them, held carefully, like something that mattered. Inside the office, the air felt still. A desk, 2 chairs, a window looking out at the parking lot. Ordinary space, meant for ordinary conversations. The girl sat with her feet not quite touching the floor. She folded her hands in her lap. The teacher took the chair beside her. "This doesn't mean you did anything wrong," the teacher said softly. "It just means we want to understand." The girl nodded, though her eyes stayed on the floor. Another adult entered the room, calm, professional, with a voice that carried patience instead of urgency. Introductions were made, simple words, no labels, no big explanations. Questions followed, gently paced. How long had the lunchbox been the same? Did the girl feel tired during the day? Was there someone at home who helped her get ready in the morning? The girl answered what she could, When she didn't know, she said so. When she wasn't sure, she paused before speaking. No one hurried her. At one point, the girl looked up at the teacher and asked, "Is this going to take long?" The teacher smiled. "As long as it needs to." That answer seemed to ease something. The girl leaned back slightly. Her shoulders no longer held quite so tight. Outside the office, the day continued. Children laughed on the playground. A delivery truck rolled past the school. Somewhere, a phone rang and was answered. Life did not stop. The teacher noticed that as time passed, the girl stopped glancing at the lunchbox. It sat on the floor beside her chair, closed again, no longer clutched or guarded. That felt important. Eventually, the conversation ended. Plans were mentioned. Not big promises, just next steps, people who would check in, appointments that would happen later, support that would come slowly, not all at once. Nothing sounded dramatic. Everything sounded real. As they stood to leave, the girl hesitated at the door. "Am I still coming to school tomorrow?" she asked. The teacher felt her throat tighten. She answered carefully, honestly. "Yes," she said. "School is still your place." The girl nodded. That seemed to matter more than anything else. Back in the classroom, the desks waited just as they always had. Papers lay where they had been left. The board still held half-erased words from the morning lesson. The teacher stood alone for a moment. She realized then that calling for help had not been the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing that this call should have been made earlier. That the signs had been there, quietly asking for attention. She thought of how easy it was to miss what didn't shout. The girl returned to her seat and opened her notebook. She picked up her pencil and began to write, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a pause. But the teacher knew better. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not completely, but enough to change the direction of things. As the final bell rang, the teacher watched the girl pack her bag. She placed the lunchbox inside without hesitation and zipped the backpack closed. At the door, the girl turned back. "Thank you," she said. The teacher nodded. It wasn't relief she felt then, and it wasn't pride. It was the quiet understanding that this call hadn't solved everything. It had simply made it impossible to keep pretending nothing was wrong. And sometimes, that was the most important beginning of all. The answers did not arrive all at once. They came slowly, over days, then weeks, like pieces of a picture that only made sense when placed side by side. No single conversation explained everything. No single moment solved it. The teacher learned this first. After school, she met with people whose jobs were to listen and connect details. The meetings were calm, careful, and full of pauses. Notes were taken. Questions were asked again, this time with context. What emerged was not a secret hidden on purpose. It was a life stretched thin. At home, mornings were unpredictable. Some days began smoothly. Others did not. There were days when simply getting up took more effort than anyone outside the house could see. The girl had learned to adapt. She woke herself up. She dressed quietly. She packed the same lunchbox, not because it was full, but because it was expected. A routine that made things look normal from the outside. The teacher listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She learned that the girl's mother lived with a condition that came and went without warning. On good days, everything felt almost ordinary. On difficult days, small tasks became mountains. There was care in the home. There was love. But there was also exhaustion. The girl's father worked long hours, often leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. Not because he wanted to be absent, but because staying meant falling behind on things that could not wait. Bills, appointments, responsibilities that stacked higher every month. Help had been asked for before. Forms had been filled out. Calls had been made. Messages had been left. Each step led to another step, another wait, another reminder that support rarely arrived quickly. Nothing had felt urgent enough. The teacher felt something settle heavily in her chest as she listened. From the outside, the girl had looked quiet and capable. From the inside, she had been managing more than most adults ever saw. The lunchbox made sense now. Not as a mystery, but as a solution the girl had created for herself. A way to avoid questions. A way to keep the day moving forward. At school, she could be the version of herself that didn't ask for anything. The teacher thought of all the times the girl had said, "I'm okay." She had meant it, in her own way. As the days passed, the teacher noticed small changes. The girl began to accept help more easily. She asked questions she would have once kept to herself. She no longer rushed through her work as if trying to disappear. But not everything changed. Some habits stayed. The careful way she packed her bag, the way she watched the clock, the instinct to wait instead of ask. One afternoon, as they worked quietly together, the teacher said, "You know, you don't have to be the one who holds everything together." The girl thought about that for a long moment. "I didn't know anyone else could," she said finally. The words were simple. They were also heavy. The teacher realized then that the hardest part of what the girl had been carrying wasn't the responsibility itself. It was the belief that no one would notice, or if they did, that it would already be too late. As plans moved forward, support began to take shape. Slowly, carefully, with limits and delays that no one tried to hide. There were no promises of easy fixes, but there were people paying attention now. At the end of one long day, the teacher watched the girl walk out of the classroom, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. The lunchbox was still inside, closed, but it no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a chapter that had finally been read, one that explained what school never showed, and what silence had been trying to say all along. Once the questions began, the teacher noticed something unexpected. The girl did not speak as someone who felt wronged. She spoke as someone who felt responsible. In the quiet moments, between lessons, during reading time, while waiting for the bell, the girl shared pieces of her thinking. Not all at once, not in a rush, just enough to let the truth settle where it needed to. She talked about mornings, about how she learned to tell the difference between good days and difficult ones without being told, about how she listened before speaking, about how she decided when it was better to stay quiet and when it was safe to ask a question. "I didn't want to make things harder," she said once, her eyes on the page of her book. The teacher nodded, though her heart felt heavy. The girl explained how she watched adults carefully, how she noticed tired faces and unfinished conversations, how she learned that waiting often made problems seem smaller, even when they weren't. "If I didn't say anything," the girl said, "then no one had to worry." The teacher understood then that the lunchbox had never been about hiding. It had been about protecting her mother from feeling like she was failing on hard days, protecting her father from feeling guilty when work kept him away, protecting teachers from needing to make difficult decisions. Most of all, protecting the fragile balance that kept everything from falling apart. The girl had become an expert at reading rooms, at sensing when help was available and when it was not, at deciding which version of herself would be easiest for others to handle. At school, she chose the quiet one. The teacher saw how this skill showed up in other ways. The girl never asked for extra time, never complained when instructions were unclear, never pointed out mistakes that weren't hers. She filled in gaps without being asked. One afternoon, the teacher gently asked, "Who helps you when things feel like too much?" The girl frowned, thinking hard. "I help myself," she said finally. The answer wasn't said with pride. It was said with certainty. That certainty frightened the teacher more than tears ever could have. Children, she knew, were not meant to build their own safety nets. They were not meant to carry adult worries quietly, hoping no one would notice the weight. And yet, that was exactly what the girl had done. The teacher began to respond differently. She checked in more often. She offered choices instead of instructions. She reminded the girl, again and again, that needing help was not the same as causing trouble. Some days the girl accepted this easily. Other days she nodded politely and returned to old habits. Change, the teacher realized, did not arrive all at once. It arrived in moments. In the way the girl raised her hand one day to ask for clarification. In the way she hesitated less before speaking. In the way she began to leave the lunchbox in her bag during class. Small shifts. Quiet victories. Still, The teacher knew there was one thing the girl had not said out loud. Not yet. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the classroom floor, the teacher watched the girl carefully pack her things. "Can I tell you something?" the girl asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," the teacher said. The girl held her backpack close and looked up. "I thought if I was good enough," she said slowly, "everything would stay okay." The teacher felt the weight of that sentence settle between them. Being good, being quiet, being easy. The girl had believed those things could hold the world together. The teacher knelt beside her desk and met her eyes. "You were never supposed to do that alone," she said gently. The girl didn't answer, but for the first time she didn't look away either. And in that still moment, the teacher understood that the most difficult part of the story was not what had happened. It was how long the girl had believed it was her job to make it easier for everyone else. For a long time, the teacher believed there would be a single moment she could point to. A mistake, a missed question, a day when the right words were not spoken. But as the story continued to unfold, she realized there was no such moment. There had been many, each one small, each one reasonable on its own. A form that took too long to process, a message that was never returned, a day when exhaustion felt heavier than concern, a choice to wait until tomorrow. No one had meant to ignore anything. The teacher sat through another quiet meeting, listening as the pieces lined up. Not as accusations, not as excuses, just facts, placed carefully on the table. Every adult involved had noticed something. A neighbor had seen the girl walking home alone more often. A staff member had noticed she never joined snack time. A relative had sensed something was off but didn't know what to say. Each person assumed someone else was closer, more informed, better positioned to act. No one thought it was their turn to be first. The teacher felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. Not shock, not anger, but recognition. She thought of herself. Of all the days she had noticed the lunchbox and chosen patience instead of interruption. Of how easily good intentions could turn into delays. Waiting had felt kind. Waiting had felt respectful. Waiting had also given silence more space. The truth was simple. And that was what made it difficult to accept. Nothing dramatic had failed. Systems hadn't collapsed. Rules hadn't been broken. People had done what they were used to doing, passing concerns gently along, trusting that time would smooth the edges. But time had only taught the girl to wait too. The teacher remembered the girl's words. "I can wait." That was the moment everything shifted, because the real problem had never been the lunchbox. It had been the quiet agreement everyone made without realizing it, that waiting was safer than acting, and that someone else would step in before it mattered. The teacher understood now that the girl had learned this lesson from the adults around her. Not from what they said, but from what they didn't do. As plans continued and responsibilities were finally named, the teacher felt a mix of relief and regret. Relief that attention had arrived. Regret that it had taken so long. One afternoon after the classroom had emptied, she sat alone at her desk and replayed the year in her mind. The smiles, the routines, the moments that had seemed ordinary at the time. She wondered how many times she had walked past the answer without seeing it. Not because she didn't care, but because caring had felt complicated. The next day, she greeted the girl at the door as always. The girl smiled back, a little less carefully than before. School continued. Lessons were taught. Life moved forward. But the teacher knew something essential had changed. She no longer believed that danger announced itself loudly. She no longer believed that waiting was neutral. And she no longer believed that responsibility always belonged to someone else. The hardest truth was also the clearest. Everyone had been kind. Everyone had been busy. Everyone had been waiting. And the cost of that waiting had been carried quietly by a child who believed it was her job to make things easier for everyone else. The teacher looked around the room, at the desks, the floor, the places where silence liked to hide. She promised herself something then. Next time she would not wait for the moment to become obvious. Because by the time everyone agrees something needs to be done, a child has already learned how to survive without asking. Change did not arrive with a clean edge. It came in small adjustments that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. A different tone in conversations, a new name added to a list, a meeting scheduled not for some day, but for a date that actually appeared on the calendar. The teacher learned to recognize progress by its quietness. There were check-ins now. Not every day, not always at the same time, but enough to remind everyone that the girl was no longer invisible. Questions were asked with care. Answers were taken seriously, even when they were incomplete. Nothing was rushed. Some days felt almost normal again. Others felt heavy in ways that were hard to explain. The girl continued to come to school each morning. She still arrived on time. She still smiled. She still carried her backpack carefully. The lunchbox stayed inside, closed. But it no longer held the same tension. It was just an object again, metal, scratched, ordinary. The kind of thing children forgot on shelves and found weeks later without much thought. That change mattered more than anyone said out loud. At school, routines shifted gently. The teacher offered quiet choices instead of firm instructions. She made space where there hadn't been any before. Space to pause, to ask, to say, "Not today." Sometimes the girl used it. Sometimes she didn't. Both were allowed. There were appointments the girl attended after school, and others she missed because days didn't always cooperate. There were conversations that felt helpful and others that felt confusing. Progress did not move in a straight line. The teacher learned this too. She noticed how the girl still watched the clock, how she still packed her bag with care, how she sometimes hesitated before raising her hand, as if checking whether it was truly acceptable. Old habits did not disappear just because attention arrived. One afternoon during reading time, the girl looked up suddenly. "Is it okay if I don't finish this today?" she asked. The teacher paused, just for a moment. Then she smiled. "Yes," she said. "It's okay." The girl nodded and returned to her book. That was all. But the teacher felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest, not because it was dramatic, but because it was new. At home, things adjusted as best they could. Some days were smoother, others were not. Help arrived in pieces, not packages. Support came with limits, and those limits were frustrating. But there was something else now. Awareness. People were paying attention. Not perfectly, not constantly, but enough to notice when something shifted out of place. The teacher understood that this was not a story of fixing everything. It was a story of catching something before it broke further. As the weeks passed, the girl laughed more easily. Not louder, just more often. She joined a game once, then again. She began to leave her backpack on the hook instead of keeping it at her feet. Still, some days she sat quietly on the steps at recess watching. The teacher let her. Not every quiet moment needed to be solved. One evening, as the teacher gathered her things to leave, she found herself standing by the small table near the window, the place where the lunchbox had first been opened. Sunlight no longer reached it. The room was dim now, peaceful. She realized then that change did not mean erasing what had happened. It meant building around it, carefully, slowly, with patience that did not confuse waiting with safety. The girl would carry parts of this story with her for a long time. Some lessons would take years to fully unlearn. Some questions would return when she least expected them, but she would not carry them alone anymore. And for the teacher, that knowledge mattered, because sometimes the most important outcome isn't a perfect ending. It's knowing that when things began to change, they did not change because everything was suddenly easy. They changed because someone finally stayed, watched closely, and chose not to look away again. The classroom looked the same. That was the strange part. The desks stood in their usual rows. The board held yesterday's notes half erased. The reading corner waited with its soft pillows and worn books. If someone had walked in without knowing the story, nothing would have seemed different at all. But the teacher felt it immediately. The absence. The lunchbox no longer rested beneath one desk. There was no careful placement in the morning, no quiet click of the latch. The space where it used to be felt larger than it should have. like a missing word in a familiar sentence. The teacher straightened papers and took a slow breath. Teaching had taught her many things over the years, but one lesson returned now with clarity. Some changes are invisible to everyone, except the people who noticed too late. The day began. Students arrived with the same energy as always, talking, laughing, dragging backpacks behind them. The girl entered with the others. She smiled when she saw the teacher and went to her seat. Her backpack went on the hook, not under the desk. The teacher noticed. She pretended not to. Lessons moved forward. Questions were asked and answered. The rhythm of the classroom carried them along. Still, the teacher found herself watching small moments with a new attention. When the girl raised her hand, the teacher waited. When she hesitated, the teacher waited longer. Waiting felt different now. It wasn't hesitation anymore. It was space. During snack time, the teacher walked the room as usual. The children opened their food. The familiar sounds returned. The girl reached into her backpack and took out a simple snack provided by the school. She ate quietly. Nothing dramatic happened. And yet, the teacher felt her throat tighten. Later, while the class worked independently, the teacher sat at her desk and thought about guilt. Not the loud kind that demanded punishment, but the quiet kind that followed you home and waited there. She wondered how many times she had chosen the comfort of routine over the discomfort of asking hard questions. How many times she had trusted that time would soften things without checking what time was actually doing. She thought of the girl's careful voice. "I can wait." That sentence echoed now, louder than it ever had before. At the end of the day, the teacher stood by the door to say goodbye. Children passed her in a blur of movement and noise. The girl paused. "See you tomorrow," she said. "Yes," the teacher replied. "Tomorrow." The girl walked down the hall, backpack light against her shoulders. The teacher watched until she disappeared around the corner. When the classroom finally emptied, the teacher stayed behind. She moved slowly, turning off lights, stacking chairs, erasing the board. At the small table near the window, she stopped. This was where everything had shifted, where she had finally chosen to stop waiting, where a quiet object had asked a question no one wanted to answer. She placed her hand on the tabletop and closed her eyes. Regret pressed in, not sharp, not crushing, but steady. She understood now that caring did not always look like kindness. Sometimes it looked like interruption. Sometimes it looked like acting before certainty arrived. The teacher straightened and picked up her bag. Tomorrow would come with new lessons, new worries, new chances to miss things. But it would also come with a promise she had made to herself. She would notice sooner. She would ask again. She would not mistake silence for safety. As she turned off the final light and closed the door, the classroom settled into stillness. It would welcome students again in the morning, and one teacher would walk back in carrying something new, not answers, not solutions, but the quiet weight of knowing that once you truly see something, you don't get to unsee it. Relief did not arrive the way people imagine it. It didn't come with applause or clear endings or moments where everything suddenly made sense. It came quietly, disguised as something almost ordinary. The teacher noticed it one morning when the girl arrived late, not very late, just enough to be noticed. The girl slipped into the classroom, a little out of breath, her hair still damp as if it had been hurriedly brushed. She looked at the clock, then at the teacher, waiting for the familiar tightening in her chest. It didn't come. "Good morning," the teacher said simply. "We're glad you're here." The girl nodded and went to her seat. That was all, but something loosened. Over the next few days, moments like that appeared, small, unannounced, easy to overlook. The teacher made room for them without drawing attention. When the girl forgot a pencil, one appeared on her desk without comment. When she struggled with a question, the teacher waited instead of moving on. When she seemed tired, no one asked her to explain why. Nothing dramatic changed, but the pressure did. At recess, the girl still spent some days on the steps, watching. Other days, she joined a game for a few minutes, then stepped away when she felt done. No one told her to stay. No one told her to go. That choice belonged to her now. One afternoon, as the class worked on a group project, the girl hesitated near the edge of a circle of desks. In the past, she would have stepped back, letting others decide without her. This time she stayed. "I can help with that part," she said softly. The other children nodded and made space. The teacher pretended to be busy across the room, but she saw it all. Later, the girl approached her desk. "Is it okay if I take this paper home?" she asked. "I want to finish it tomorrow." The teacher smiled. "That sounds like a plan." The girl smiled back, not carefully. Not politely, but easily. It startled them both. At home, things continued to move slowly. Some days felt steady, others felt uncertain, but there was a difference now that couldn't be measured on a calendar. When something felt wrong, it was named sooner. When something felt heavy, it was shared. When waiting happened, it was chosen, not forced. The girl still carried habits with her. She still checked the clock, still packed her bag neatly, still listened more than she spoke. But she no longer held herself responsible for everything. One evening, as the teacher prepared lessons for the next day, she found a folded note on her desk. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. It read, "Thank you for noticing." Nothing more. The teacher held the note for a long moment. She realized then that relief didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It meant knowing that something small but important had shifted direction. The next morning, the girl arrived early. She hung her backpack on the hook and took her seat. The desk beside her was empty, waiting for another student who would arrive soon. She looked around the room, calm and unhurried. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't watching for what might go wrong. She was simply there. The teacher stood at the front of the classroom, looking out at the children she had promised to protect. Not perfectly, not always correctly, but honestly. She understood now that sometimes the greatest change doesn't come from fixing everything. It comes from a small, steady presence. From someone who stays close enough to notice. From a moment where waiting is replaced, not by urgency or fear, but by care. And for the girl, that small kind of relief was enough to breathe again. Enough to trust that tomorrow didn't have to be carried alone. Enough to believe that help, when it arrived quietly, could still change everything. Time moved on, the way it always does. The school year edged toward its end. Posters on the walls were replaced. Books were returned to shelves. The classroom slowly prepared itself for another group of students who would soon take these seats, bring their own routines, their own quiet habits. From the outside, the story seemed finished. The girl came to school every day. She learned. She laughed sometimes. She struggled other times. Nothing about her stood out in a way that demanded attention anymore. That, the teacher realized, was exactly the point. One afternoon, as the sunlight stretched long across the floor, the teacher asked the class to write about something they had learned that year. Something that didn't come from a book. Pencils moved, pages filled. When the teacher later read through the papers, one stood out. It was short. The handwriting was careful, but less tense than it had once been. "I learned that being quiet doesn't always mean being okay," it said, "and that sometimes people don't help because they don't see." The teacher closed her eyes. She thought about how close she had come to being one of those people. How easily the year could have passed without interruption. How routine could have carried them all forward, smooth and unquestioned. She thought about the lunchbox. How it had sat there day after day, asking nothing. How it had been easier to ignore because it never caused trouble. How silence had almost been mistaken for safety. At the end of the day, the teacher walked the girl to the door. "Have a good break," she said. "You too," the girl replied. She hesitated, then added, "I think I like asking questions now." The teacher smiled. "That's a good thing to like." The girl nodded and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of children spilling into the afternoon light. The teacher stood there longer than usual, watching the hallway empty. She knew this story did not end with certainty. The girl would grow. Life would bring new challenges. Some lessons would have to be relearned more than once. There were no guarantees. But there was something else. Awareness. That evening, as the teacher locked her classroom door for the last time that year, she paused and looked back inside. At the desks, at the quiet corners, at the places where small things like to hide. She understood now that the most dangerous problems were rarely loud. They didn't announce themselves. They waited patiently, trusting that someone else would notice first. And too often, everyone agreed. As the lights went out, the teacher carried one question with her. A question she knew would follow her into every classroom, every year after this one. Not a question of blame, not a question of fear. A simple, uncomfortable one. How many times do we see signs and choose to believe someone else will do something? The girl had learned that being quiet didn't mean being okay. The teacher had learned something too. That noticing is not enough, that caring is not always gentle, and that the smallest moments, the ones that seem easy to dismiss, can be the last warnings we get. Some stories end with answers. This one ended with a responsibility, to listen when nothing is being said, to look twice at what seems ordinary, to open the lunchbox not with judgment or panic, but with attention. Because sometimes the most important sound is not a cry for help, it's the silence we almost ignore.